Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to be here for more than a day so we can start and sustain some conversations. I'm very pleased about the 2 weeks. So Ranji, thank you for inviting me. Also, thank you for that really lovely introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you all for coming out at this ungodly early hour of the day. I'm going to jump into this. This is a bit long, and there's a, well, you'll see. There's a set of lists, but it's kind of setting up a series of discussions that I think are going to be happening over the next few days. And normally we'd address questions about the university system by talking about policy change, reformist or radical policy change. And I've done a fair amount of this myself, and I'm going to do more this week. And I made this chart not to enlist you into coming to all these other things just because you're here now, but to sort of clarify the topics to myself that I'm going to be talking about. So I would normally be today talking about academic freedom, about managerialism, about funding, as was just mentioned, about the humanities political economy more generally. But the problem is that the critique of policy assumes the stability of liberal knowledge structures like universities and funding agencies, and also assumes the government's interest in public deliberation about policy, and also interest in the views of knowledge workers, professors, researchers, social movement intellectuals, trained police observers, and so many others. And we can't now, and I think this is obvious, assume either of these things, either stability or interest. I'm not alone in feeling that the US is in the midst of a totalitarian takeover of culture and knowledge, our version of Orbanism or Putinism, in which the regime treats autonomous thinking or even believing the evidence of your own eyes as a kind of treason. Trumpism doesn't just want to extort and humiliate universities, take them down another notch, but to eliminate them as a rival source of reality that stays independent of political power. And this is not an isolated movement. Our academic colleagues, not only in Hungary and Russia, but also in Turkey, Uganda, and India, have lost basic intellectual autonomy. As this was happening in the US in 2025, university presidents and boards did not articulate the grounds of university autonomy or scholarship's necessary freedom. They mainly showed a desire to bargain with the regime, which has dragged them into a theater of subjugation. Building alternatives to world authoritarian rule needs deeper resources than policy reform. So I'm going to talk about cultural power and transformation and criticism. I mean, these are the weapons of the weak, but they can and do work. And in reality, as an attempt to restore a residual and regressed culture, Trumpism is very weak. Meanwhile, thinking as such is never weak. Okay, so some context. I mean, nearly 40 years ago, the Jamaican British cultural critic Stuart Hall correctly diagnosed Thatcherism as a civilizational movement. Hall saw it as a campaign to redefine Britain's entire way of life by creating a new sensibility, a new definition of British identity. For Hall, this meant that Thatcherism wasn't only about cutting taxes and empowering private corporations. Thatcher and her networks had set about building a new British civilization. Hall insisted that the political left needed to do the same thing, not simply in reaction, but by advancing its own common purposes. Hall called on the left to build what he called a new cultural order. The left's choice, he wrote in 1988, is between becoming historically irrelevant or beginning to sketch out an entirely new form of civilization, his term. Hall's wish for a new cultural order from the left was not fulfilled. As he was writing, the United States had joined the United Kingdom in a very effective culture war on liberalism and on the left that expanded relentlessly in the ensuing decades. The result has been the disputed but nonetheless sweeping triumph of the political right's public framing of sociocultural and economic matters in the 21st century. Center-left parties, of course, have remained active, but so far within this dominant right-wing framing. The negative effects of what we might call the right's new cultural order include ever-deepening economic inequality, disinhibited political anger, blanket rejection of responses to climate change, resurgent racism and religious hatred, nonstop sex panics, de-democratization, 25 years of wars, and now a new US imperialism. So the result of the right's 50-year experiment kind of on us are in, most are provably bad, and yet these failures have only tightened the right's political grip. So in my country of origin, which is this one, and in the two others where I have lived and worked, France and now the United Kingdom, the right has controlled the political and cultural agenda in the 21st century. The global financial crisis of 2007 to 10 seemed at first to show the world the internal contradictions of neoliberal capitalism, show that capitalism would not fulfill its updated popular promise of middle-class prosperity for everyone, regardless of race, who played by the rules, in Barack Obama's phrase. A series of progressive and left insurgencies that included Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, and many other movements around the world hinted at a turning of the political tide. But after 2015, the people who decide the national agenda have been Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, and Donald Trump. Why them? Why not say Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Zoran Mamdani, Ro Khanna, and Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy as political leaders that from different positions actively draw on a progressive intellectual and cultural system? This system would have, in this sort of alternate world, a mixture of discourses, including Murphy and Khanna's somewhat radicalized liberalism, plus ultramondialist theory like that of Hart and Negri, who wrote a tetralogy of intense conceptualizations of a new world for the left, and including the worker co-research tradition via Roman Alcadi or through Matteo Pasquinelli's recent labor theory of technology, all of which elaborate on the intelligence and intellectuality of non-college workers. In addition to this glimpse of solidarity across the educational divide, there's heterodox economics that has been rethinking global finance for climate justice, new models of democratization and political affect, and the work of many decolonial, abolitionist, queer, and trans theorists of relations between structure and identity that has taken off in the wake of the global financial crisis. A new cultural order would rest on new common capacities of hermeneutical power and interpretive agency. So let me ask the naive question again, given all this stuff that really is going on and that in fact is very popular in the outside world, why isn't this work on CNN and deciding how the mainstream media frames everything? The pieces are there, so why not paradigm dominance, cultural hegemony in Gramsci's sense, for, say, the Reverend William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign? Okay, we all have good reasons for why progressives don't control government and dominant culture, but I don't think some obvious advantages for the right, like their money, explain, at least fully, the mystery of their continuing ascendance. Why, to repeat, has Stuart Hall's new culture in the Anglophone world continued to come from the right in reaction against positions represented by Hall and so many others? Where is Hall's new civilization of the left, its new hybrids of democratic, racially egalitarian, gender anti-normative, eco-socialist programs setting the terms of public debate? Okay, so there's a next section coming up, which is more or less about the Trumpian culmination of this knowledge crisis that's been in development for decades. Okay, so here I'm going to focus on a twin reason for the left's non-hegemony that has been, I think, relatively neglected. That is our current knowledge crisis, and then the university's kind of ironic contribution to it. This crisis takes the familiar form of radical polarization of public opinion. The US is off the charts on this measure. Here's one example of that. I mean, this polarization doesn't come naturally. Your big politicians really have to work for it. It's a polarization rooted in the often noted destruction of not just shared values, which never existed, but of shared data, facts, and methods of resolving factual disputes. This existed more than it does now, however imperfectly. Public interpretation is a pillar of common life. Societies have interpretive arbitrators of both normal and traumatic events, like in the old days, Walter Cronkite-style national media, and also, including these days, universities. In the US, these and others have been the subject of decades-long campaigns of delegitimation, which we call culture wars and info wars. They are also knowledge wars. The US knowledge war operates on two levels. One targets what the right considers left substantive positions. An example is equal rights for trans people. Another is that slavery was a defining part of US society that continues to shape it today. Another is the idea that all institutions should be racially diverse. Another is defund the police in the sense of replacing most policing with social services. Another is replacing superpower coercion with negotiations via an international law. The right has been active on every front trying to keep these types of progressive belief and the progressive knowledge underlying them from forming the cultural mainstream. Okay, a second level is just as important. This level is not about what the alleged knowledge is, but about how you have knowledge about knowledge. This is a battle over epistemology. It involves contestation over methods of interpretation, the nature of valid evidence, and so on. I mean, I'd call this epistemic struggle, this second level. It's a battle for interpretive methods and for whether interpretation is even required. Okay, so here's a fairly straightforward example of the two levels. And you'll have noted that attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, were driven at least in part by outrage at critical race theory, or CRT. CRT was a set of concepts and methods developed in the 1980s and 1990s when it helped theorize the need for something like DEI, as well as a lot of other stronger things. CRT is theory. It bundles one of the right's hated substantive projects, racial equality, or simply sort of racial desegregation, with a justifying epistemology. So the knowledge war acts on both of these elements. It seeks first the blocking of widely desired and functionally successful social outcomes, like enough racial equity to avoid civil Cold War. It seeks, second, the active, ongoing rejection of the legitimacy of people gathering facts and making interpretive decisions packaged for a time as CRT that justified DEI, to reject the epistemic processes embodied in CRT, as well as the outcome, or DEI. The right needs to discredit theories of knowledge that have developed for social and cultural analysis over the past 100 years. Okay, these targeted theories, not just the substance, but what is underneath them, often go by the general names of constructivism or anti-foundationalism. A better term would be interpretivism, except that's not a word. The shared idea is that the human mind participates in the construction of the reality that various procedures turn into valid knowledge about that reality. Much of human thought involves developing good procedures for interpretation. One doesn't simply observe an objective reality and then represent it in a literal way. Reality always requires interpretation, or interpretation all the way down. Again, this is 100 years of work that has generated this, so it's basically, I'm sure, familiar to you. Interpretation has methods, in spite of what people say about it, and it must be rigorous. That doesn't change the fact that persons and groups participate in creating the reality that emerges from observation of evidence and from arguments about it. Subjectivity is in there. So are the methodological procedures associated with the professions that make the interpretation of reality coherent and even valid. The world is, in a deep sense, a product of interpretation that constructs a shared and plausible reality on the basis of these methods, which are often equated with professional life and history. Okay. This kind of interpretation that I've just summarized is popularly associated equally with liberalism and with the left. This mushing together of liberal and left is broadly correct on this topic. I mean, think Stanley Fish and Frederick Jameson together on this. Also, Angela Davis, Sandra Harding, Sarah Ahmed, Robin Wiegman, Toril Moy, Richard Rorty. Hermeneutics is a battleground in US culture today. Literalist scriptural reading is the cornerstone of dispensationalist and other modes of conservative and nationalist Christianity in the US. Such Christians regard interpretation, scriptural or otherwise, as the practice of a secular humanism that has eroded the nation's foundations while mocking their religious beliefs. Epistemic foundationalism is the path to God and also the basis of the authority of the father in the family and of all the other fathers, executives, college presidents, head coaches, the president of the United States. In foundationalism, authority precedes interpretation and dispenses with it. Truth flows from authority, and authority never negotiates truth or feels the need for further study. In the pairing popularized by Michel Foucault, knowledge in this model is created by power, and power rules knowledge by deciding on its own what knowledge we are going to be using today. Foundationalism has its varieties, and it's not all authoritarian, but it is necessary to authoritarian epistemology. This authoritarianism is not limited to any one religion or political party and can also be found on college campuses. In addition, it has been extremely important in US life as the US culture has struggled to exit Cold War culture and figure out what to do after the Cold War was supposedly over. Would the US succeed through what was called the knowledge economy? Would emancipation from Jim Crow and some version of social equality make the US stronger? Would a great Western power set aside imperialism for the first time in history and try to do well with its intelligence instead? What was the purpose of the United States? Surely not just to be the world's policeman and its leading sponsor of coups against new democracies and creating a tilted playing field for its transnational corporations. What was the US offering its people other than security and global preeminence? Preeminence was assumed to be essential to most Americans, or by most Americans, but also seemed rather empty. In a period of questioning, foundationalism supported essentialist notions of US identity that kept such questions at bay. Any non-imperial, non-militaristic future was going to involve what I'd call a popular power of interpretation, to see the global other across difference, to do the same across cultures and national origins within the US, to steer away from centuries of violence. National interpretation of events would need to become a normal thing. Perhaps the future could bring a new awakening. The US has had many spiritual great awakenings. Perhaps the 21st century would bring an intellectual awakening, a new enlightenment based on ideas like multiracial equality and international mutual respect. What would that mean, and what forms would it take? What are all the other things to do besides fighting all the time? Such questions reflect matters of personal meaning and of the meaning of national culture. They require mass interpretation, mass engagement with hermeneutics. That interpretation of new forces and new worlds needs to set familiar foundations aside. It needs to operate as an anti-foundationalism. However, such powers of anti-foundationalist interpretation struggle to develop under culture war conditions when novel social and psychocultural analysis exists in a state of siege. Siege is the point of culture wars, besieging intellectuals and movement types so they can't build but can only defend themselves. Foundationalism, the rejection of free interpretation where truth is decided collectively, was a very important resource for keeping the pressure on. Few people were better at asserting power over knowledge and controlling hard foundations than Nixon and Kissinger, Reagan and Casey, Bush and Cheney. So in this category, Donald Trump has carved out a special place. There's no finesse and no accommodation. He's especially great at direct subjection of knowledge to power, that is, at simply brushing knowledge aside with blanket denials. The spectacle of someone defying truth with unflinching lack of concern creates shock and awe in observers. It is intimidating. It suggests the great man's powers extend to defining reality itself. It can destroy people's sense of their own knowledge and thus destroy knowledge as such. This has been the effect of a whole bunch of things that he's done, including the 30,573 documented lies Trump told during his first term that he rolled right through. There's the godfather of these lies, that the 2020 election was stolen by Biden. Trump's campaign brought about 60 court cases on this point and failed about 60 times. Knowledge defeated power, or did it? Trump never stopped asserting the steal. He was elected again. In the election, Trump voters were much more likely than Harris voters to be factually wrong about immigration, inflation, or whatever issue came up. You may have seen this chart on this very subject. I mean, the spread is just two planets, two worlds, two epistemologies, two understandings of interpretation that, just pass in the night. I mean, Trump has destroyed quite a bit of knowledge and was rewarded for it. This is one summary of this. Okay, back in office, Trump has asserted the total sovereignty of power over knowledge and all its institutions. The unitary executive is to control all knowledge workers in the government, all its inspector generals, whom Trump fires at will. There shall be no knowledge production independent of the presidential will. This subjugation of knowledge exists on a level of detail that few of us can imagine. This week, for example, the New York Times reported that under President Trump, the EPA plans to stop tallying gains for the health benefits caused by curbing two of the most widespread deadly air pollutants, fine particulate matter and ozone, and will only count costs to industry of that regulation. Trump uses his power to make knowledge disappear. The same goes for the knowledge products of the media, the courts, and the universities. Suing media organizations over edits you don't like is insane, except it has become a regularized assertion of the subjugability of knowledge to sovereign power. The right understands that in addition to asserting traditional values on the level of substance, their core power is coercion on the level of hermeneutics. Their politics is wrapped around what the philosopher C.S. Jenkins calls hermeneutic disregard. When you say, I have been displaying aggressive and belittling behavior in the workplace, and I say, no, I'm just kidding around, I am disregarding your epistemological standing. I mean, we've seen in the United States a continuous insurgency against epistemic parity, against epistemic justice among all the parties in a conceptual disagreement, and coming from one side, not from all the parties, which has regularized epistemic coercion. The result of this double movement, right-wing, often authoritarian values, plus epistemic coercion on this other level of knowledge, constitutes our knowledge crisis. And it has the following main features. Here's our first list. We have first the assertion of false knowledge that declares itself immune to falsification. This is knowledge grounded in a quasi-sovereign power to assert. It is bullshit in the philosophical sense, in which the speaker cares not about truth or falsity, but only about controlling the belief and the response of the audience. Bullshit of state makes challenging the bullshit difficult and costly. Two, next is the resulting education of the general public about the value of knowledge and of thinking. Thinking doesn't in this model make any difference. It doesn't get you anywhere. It produces a lot of he said, she says. Your thinking can simply be waved away as bullshit by any jackass, no matter how biased, angry, or ignorant about your topic. Thinking becomes bullshit, so why bother? Three, rather than think, be angry. In the knowledge crisis, it's anger that lets you tap directly into the truth as lived by real people and also into the truth of the people who run the world. Trump and Vance, the president and vice president of the United States, excel at replacing thought with furious self-righteous denunciation. Remember their joint demolition of Vladimir Zelensky on his first visit to Trump's new Oval Office. It's the theater of knowledge destruction. Zelensky was not allowed to introduce a fact about his own country that fabricates the truth of anger. In a knowledge crisis, don't worry, be angry. Okay, now there are two groups who are especially offensive to anger's pseudo-knowledge. One is social movement people, and the other is professors. The latter group broadens out to all members of the liberal professions, that is, care-oriented in particular, teachers, designers, screenwriters, doctors, knowledge workers, social workers, the cognitariat in general. And the reason is simple. Social movements and knowledge workers represent emergent cultures, to use Raymond Williams' venerable term, and they produce new knowledge to explain and justify this emergent culture. The standing thread of both movement and professional knowledge is that they will make their emergent culture the dominant culture. It's a primal fear. For example, the civil rights movement had an expansive set of concrete policy demands, and Black studies scholars had extensive critiques of white supremacist elements in every aspect of the US past and present. Such an alignment between social movements and universities was fused in the public mind in the 1960s, even though university managers in the 1960s, as in the 2020s, mainly opposed those movements and often disciplined professors and students who seemed too sympathetic to them. Emergent knowledges are always accompanied by new evidence, new arguments, unexpected and often unwelcome conclusions. They often prescribe fundamental change. Stop doing secret medical experiments on Black people without their consent in one era. Stop excluding trans athletes from sports in our era. The right has recast emergent knowledge from either movements or professionals as elitist. The epistemic dismissal of professional knowledge is the fourth major feature of the knowledge crisis. And here's kind of, think how it flows. I mean, on the one hand, it's absurd. On the other hand, it's really powerful, this particular structure. Okay, I don't want to whitewash professional knowledge workers. I mean, we are often stubborn, wrong, and destructive. I mean, there's the 50-year crusade by many lawyers against affirmative action, or the bad neoclassical economics that led to deindustrialization. But many, if not most professionals, not only pursue emergent knowledge, I mean, this is the definition of research, but do so in defiance of the wishes of those in power. Some even believe that part of their job is to speak truth to power. This regularly earns them, /us, the wrath of the powerful. So what practical effects does this have in the world? When the system of combined movement and professional knowledge loses public authority, authority returns to the seats of power. The various sovereigns can decide what is true without negotiating with experts, and you're familiar with all these examples. Robert Kennedy doesn't need to care about the views of the NIH's professional boards or vaccine scientists. Elon Musk doesn't need to care about feminist frameworks or federal law that define AI-created revenge porn as abuse and illegal, which it is. Donald Trump can replace international law with his personal morality. Any ICE killing can be self-defense against an alleged domestic terrorist. Any Yahoo can own any lib. The outcome is the big lie. Emergent knowledge, especially of professionals, is elitist, and thus this knowledge is the oppressor of the people. Its own policy ideas have actually failed their base, especially on economics, most recently captured by this category of affordability. In weak compensation, they wield this blanket discrediting of the ideas of liberals on the left. This is a culture where they have this capacity that needs to be replaced, and very urgently now. And again, I don't think this is a matter only for policy reform, for fact checking and correcting, although this remains absolutely essential, but also of making emergent left cultural elements into a dominant cultural order. Okay, so how? This is the hard part. Another next section. Okay, now, of course, any transformation ultimately depends on large social movements, which have the power to shift public feelings. But criticism and theory play their own major roles. And the elements of a new cultural order already exist as part of what enraged the right in the first place. These come from the humanities, from philosophy and criticism, from literary knowledge. And these bring us back to epistemology, to the anti-foundationalist epistemology that demands a permanent labor of interpretation in order to understand and act truthfully in the world. Okay, the bulk of this work has been done by intellectuals within knowledge institutions. This is a limitation that I'll come back to at the end. So this means philosophers, theorists, and critics, but also scientists, machine learning programmers, tech lawyers, high school teachers, who all drew conclusions from their spheres of work over these past decades that were occasionally fed into the wider mix. This disparate group got lumped together by Barbara and John Ehrenreich into the influential category professional managerial class, or PMC. This is a disputed term, but I think it's a useful one. So I'll spare you an exegesis, except to say that academics, including radical academics, are founding members of this group. Structurally, we have a hard time either bonding with labor against capital or fighting the managers who work for capital. There's an analogy here with Gramsci's traditional and organic intellectuals. Members of the PMC are often both at the same time. The PMC and its knowledge workers is not only a divided class of widely divergent economic outcomes, especially divided between the managerial and the professorial or professional sides, but it is also a contradictory class position, and it certainly feels that way. I find it especially painful that its members almost never confront managers on the basis of the rights of professional knowledge workers. And in addition, there's no movement among academics to seize the means of knowledge production, in spite of my recent call in public books to do exactly that. The dominant affect isn't anger, but ambivalence, which puts us at a disadvantage with both managers who have structured institutional authority and with the anger movements. We're propelled by this, much more dynamic passion. So I've called this formation submissive individualism in the US literary tradition installed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it's a major liability when faced with serious financial and political power. And yet, in spite of not having fully emerged as an agent of history, the PMC subset that I focus on here, literary and cultural critics, did break from the Cold War cultural order on which the right still insists. They did lay the foundations, the elements of the new culture that Hall was pointing towards. So I need to set the scene a bit for this, for what the critics were starting to rebel against. And that context was the Cold War, which imposed serious knowledge demands on universities that we continue to operate within and also rebel against. The Cold War is the foundation of Thatcherism and Reaganism, who both adapted it while preserving its basic elements. Okay, so the first aspect of this Cold War set of Cold War demands on on universities, was that universities support US economic preeminence and geopolitical dominance. The second was to form human capital in a way that served what was called the free enterprise system. In other words, generate armies of compliant white-collar employees for J.K. Galbraith's technostructure. The third Cold War knowledge demand was that the university sustain the intellectual conditions for stable two-party constitutional democracy, or what I'd call managerial democracy. And then fourth and last chronologically, really taking shape in the late Cold War period of the 1970s and 80s, the university was asked to teach and manage society's multiple identities, to do diversity management, that is. The idea was to provide a space for students of color, working class students, and later gender nonconforming students, as long as that space did not threaten any change not sought by society's rulers. So criticism, which is very much in this mix, and which I'm going to use here, I'm going to talk about this later, it's a loose term for a porous amalgamation of literary study, linguistics, philosophy, history, complet, theory with a capital T. Criticism also had Cold War obligations as the handmaid of the dominant disciplines. First, it had to legitimate US preeminence by defining the US as the cultural heir to Imperial Britain. Criticism, in effect, defined American literary heritage as white English culture. Our disciplines established college-level American literary culture as structurally a white culture. Second, to support white-collar labor markets, criticism taught soft skills like writing and communicating for the workplace while accepting and even affirming the epistemic priority of economics and technoscience over humanities perspectives on business and politics. Third, to support managerial democracy, Cold War criticism celebrated individual self-cultivation as antagonistic to collective action. It also helped undermine egalitarian forms of democracy with its focus on canons defined exclusively through aesthetic masterworks authored by being superior to the rest of us. And then fourth, criticism in the later Cold War was expected to widen the literary canon by making it less Eurocentric, more inclusive of women writers in all periods, slightly more queer, and somewhat more multiracial or multicultural. But these acts of belated and often grudging widening were treated as a ridiculously big deal. Nothing more controversial had ever happened at Stanford than the inclusion of a Toni Morrison novel about Black American life in a humanities class. A generation of Stanford reactionaries, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, have never recovered. Lit professors offered the world the unedifying spectacle of fighting each other in the canon wars, which made the racial integration of the literary curriculum seem controversial, even divisive. The upshot was to affirm the Cold War liberalism of figures like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who claimed multiculturalism would lead to civil war. Criticism was to help ensure that the widening of identity norms would not displace European cultures from cultural dominance and would not lead to cultural equality. So in short, criticism was given a set of important cultural functions in support of Cold War capitalism. It offered Eurocultural grounds for US disparity in power and resources, made advanced literacy a form of human capital, naturalized managerial democracy as desired by rising middle-class US culture, and fit the now glaringly obvious multicultural population into existing hierarchies. Okay, so there's a kind of a summary with the sort of dominant general demand in Black and the red being for criticism. Okay, so I think this is still kind of an affective baseline in criticism, or by then I mean that moving away from it has a psychological cost. It's still controversialized even all these years later in really a lot of English departments. And I'll say a bit more about what happened in the 2010s, service versus symptomatic reading, et cetera, as an expression of this ongoing anxiety. But given, stating it the way I just did suggests that criticism was destined for permanent residual status, trapped in a culture that was being left behind by world events. But in fact, for more than 50 years now, critics and criticism has been slowly but steadily reinventing itself. Okay, so next section is about that. A radical minority of 60s and 70s critics have been re-theorizing epistemology, language, scientific method, political theory, and the relations between subjectivity and social identity. They generated a quiet revolution in epistemology as well as other things, but it's that layer that I'm focused on here. One that drew on social movements and yet had its own dynamics. Okay. Sorry, there's never enough drama in a list. And yet I'm going to give you another one just in the interest of time. These features of criticism all threatened the Cold War knowledge order. People that say that PowerPoint destroyed human communication would be using this series of lists coming up as an example of that. So apologies in advance. One insurgent idea was challenging the causal priority of nature to culture, and on many questions, putting culture first. For example, racial formations in society coming to be seen as prior to the alleged genetic basis of race, which was increasingly discredited. Second was self-reflexivity as a pillar of sustainable social or human knowledge. Validity required awareness of the structures, that conditioned the knowledge being produced, including limits and biases. A third conceptual insurgency was standpoint theory, which linked validity to variable social contexts and the observer's specific position in them. This theory turned the unevenness of knowledges of particular insights derived from a local standpoint into an epistemic strength. Feminist theorists were key developers, along with race and ethnic studies scholars. The founding of independent programs in Black studies, feminist studies, sexuality studies, among others, institutionalized the value of non-Eurocentric or non-mainstream perspectives by offering knowledge platforms outside mainstream departments such as English and history. A fourth was the central importance of critique itself, defined as analyzing the right by which conceptual foundations have been imposed in the first place. This is an important aspect of Michel Foucault's work and of work across literary and cultural study. A fifth move within criticism was the importance of language to consciousness and knowledge. The linguistic revolution started in the later 19th century, really exploded onto the scene in the 1950s. A sixth was that knowledge governance required the consent of the governed. Freedom struggles had brought this idea to the fore, including with the struggle for access of people of color to higher education. This led to the expansion of methods to include the methods that actually existing diverse critics wanted to use. And then finally, these six elements, among others, comprised and reinforced constructivism or anti-foundationalism. The umbrella concepts redefine verifiable knowledge as shaped by the structures of thought through which it appears rather than as independent of them. Whatever positivisms may have worked in the natural sciences, and philosophers were challenging positivism there too, knowledge in the cultural and social fields had to be anti-foundationalist. Okay, I feel like as I'm rattling this off that these are kind of obvious things to us, but my point in lining them up like this is to say that they're intellectually revolutionary to people who have not been exposed to them, and in Christian and other religious contexts. Revolutionary. Again, this is a partial list of fundamental changes to the academic understanding of the status and impacts of knowledge itself, but also fundamental changes to the public understanding of the emergent knowledges that seem to be producing so much social change. These are conceptual productions of the labor of academic critics, improved and advanced by contact with social movements. It's important to recognize that there's a kind of making history really going on here. Criticism and the humanities more broadly have the intellectual power to grossly offend not only the academic mainstream, but also the political establishment. This happened on both of the two levels that I discussed earlier. First, many of the voters who put the Republicans in the White House in 1968 detested the 60s cultural politics, detested in particular the ideals of gender and racial justice and solidarity with the victims of American violence abroad. That's Bruce Robbins writing that. And then second, they equally detested what the appearance of, even though it was not often labeled as 60s constructivist epistemology. The philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, observed negative reactions to how the social construction of X, whatever X is, was used to contest the established order of things. So we should see much, though not all of criticism, as having spent the last 50 years putting the elements in place for Hall's new cultural order of the left. It sustains, that is, epistemically, that last list, and substantively, the second, a series of what I would argue are popular demands coming out of the culture itself. Each of these elements, and we're doing a final list in a second, is the partial reversal of the Cold War demands on criticism that Thatcherism and Reaganism had expanded. Okay, so here's the first of these now substantive demands. One, criticism has engaged with that significant share of the US population that has wanted national destiny to be something other than being the presiding superpower of planet Earth. They have wanted academics to address the problem of America by identifying post-imperial culture and consciousness in works of literary art, as well as elsewhere. Already during the Cold War, this meant answering questions like, why does US democracy support Jim Crow segregation? Or why are we in Vietnam? The titles that drew me into American studies included Facing West, the metaphysics of Indian hating and empire building, and also Regeneration Through Violence, the mythology of the American frontier, which is an ongoing story. Literary study was offering public understanding of the cultural dimensions as created and analyzed in literary texts of why the US felt authoritarian rather than democratic. And recently, this demand has meant challenging anti-Black police violence, anti-Asian hate, border incarceration, transphobia, the suppression of water protectors, the use of ICE as a neo-Confederate rebel army in US cities, etc. Again, the right hates universities for supplying the conceptual elements, not just the substantive, but the conceptual underpinnings that add fuel to these would-be reversals of their culture. Okay, a second demand has been the articulation of non-economic life. This demand is for creating the narratives of a future not centered on wage work, a future without systemic exploitation and multiple forms of bondage, even a future without work as such. I've never met the person that didn't want that. Poetry, fiction, essays, theater, criticism articulate endless non-pecuniary forms of life that cannot or must not be reduced to economy. It's hard to overstate that the fundamental changes that the expanded influence of these ideas would produce. A third popular demand on university knowledge that has been answered by much criticism has been for democracy as broad political equality. This included industrial democracy in which unions would share power with corporate management in setting company policy. It included direct community power in which racialized immigrant working class communities would associate in the polity as equals. Criticism's roles have indeed included the unearthing of artistic and cultural practices that enable interpersonal behaviors not rooted in coercion. Then the fourth demand has been for academic knowledge that would explore how to have, how to feel, how to embody, how to realize egalitarian acceptance of all peoples in the society. How do we rewrite the discourses of structural racism in all its intersectional forms? What artistic forms show how to decolonize US culture on the level of public policy? This kind of demand on criticism meant that it would locate in the culture's text the expressions of life as the full range of communities tried to live it without higher authorities and coercions. Over the decades, critics and scholars have done exactly this. And then a fifth and final demand is for, in this list at least, is for the capacity to understand the world in a way that makes one feel equal to the endless confusions and challenges one faces in life. How do we grasp what is happening to us and to our communities? How do we have the knowledge we need to change the world as it must be changed? The demand here is for what I'll call interpretive agency, and I'm going to be talking more about this one on Thursday. So here's what this set looks like. And the claim here is, things are bad, but criticism is great. And it's kind of all the conflicts and horrors that we've had to deal with. And that there is actually elements pushing from left to right in this case. In sum, and in spite of our many conservative impulses, inside the university, criticism has in general showed the need to democratize knowledge's creation and use, to open new knowledge to world forces, to respect and use the cultures of the multitude. The anti-60s backlash has targeted democratized standpoint epistemologies as it has targeted the feminist, Black, and queer social movements, resting on those or interacting with those, precisely because they are so powerful and have had such pervasive influence. So you might reasonably be wondering, if it's so conceptually powerful, why hasn't the left's emergent culture become dominant, moved beyond resistance into dominance? And a big part of the answer, I mean, I'd really love to talk with you about this at length. A big part of the answer is the way that critics have worked within the university. The critics laboring on the level of the cultural order, that is the project of hegemony with its interconnected analyses leading to a new common sense, have long been unusually dependent on universities in the United States. Public communications from universities are controlled by managers rather than professors and students. And since 2000, this has gotten worse. The direct communication, the pipeline out of classrooms and libraries and laboratories is almost entirely, secret videos of outrageous moments that can be fed into the right-wing propaganda machine. Very little, just direct, all of us in this room going out town and talking to people in churches or wherever about what is going on, what's happening with our students, what we're teaching, what happens to their minds, et cetera, et cetera. University promotion systems, in addition, and citation metrics disincentivize public communication from scholars. Promotion schemes encourage everyone to be what Gramsci called a traditional intellectual. Criticism proper has been obsessed with its internal feuds, especially what I think of as the legacy dualism, asking critics to favor text over context or do aesthetics and not history, setting up a sterile debate running from Gerald Graff in the 1980s to John Guillory, this book came out a couple of years ago, through Rita Felsky and the surface versus systematic reading debate in the 2010s, which is a decade in which in literary studies, we should have been focusing on further diversification and also on fixing our terrible political economy, starting with working very concertedly on reversing adjunctification and also research poverty. And instead, there was this other thing going on. It's not fair to those folks because they also cared about the other stuff, but there was a there was a diversion or a distraction. Universities have been a platform, but also a trap. And the left hasn't developed the necessary message infrastructure, moving ideas and affects from campuses directly to our own institution, think tanks, and other platforms that aren't getting routed either through video, cell phone videos by students sitting in the back row or by senior managers basically doing PR. Nevertheless, as Hannah Arendt once promised us, when arguments are used, authority is put in abeyance. The right thinks that this has been happening to them again and again and again, that is getting shoved to one side of their own culture as they see it. It's true that the profession of criticism has been formed in relation to the official Cold War demands, but it can't and has not, in fact, stayed loyal to them. That's not where we are now, even the conservatives among us. We can bust out of the right-wing prison house, and for decades, criticism has been showing us, college and non-college people alike, how this can be done. Thank you.
We have a microphone to share questions online.
You described the, I think you said 33,000 or so lies that President Trump has told while in office, a number that increases virtually every day. But you've also described anti-foundationalism with a subjective and interpretive component as an instrument of the left, associated with the left. Do you see a contradiction there?
In other words, if you're anti-foundationalist, you can't expose lies? No, I don't think that's true. I think that anti-foundationalism is actually part of the Pinocchio project that Kessler did all those years, because it required an elaborate process of interpretation. And with the lies came an accompanying explanation of why he considers it to be, there were 5 degrees of Pinocchioism or lengths of noses. And they all involved having to assemble facts that the right was considering in a completely different way and explain why they had to be wrenched out of that context and put in this context.
But I don't see on the screen behind you any kind of check that would establish a truth as opposed to a falsehood. And I wonder if the easy appropriability of the interpretive power by the right is one reason that the right is currently in such a regnant state. In other words, I didn't hear in your account any indication that the left might be not complicit, but acquiescent in its own eclipse, as the right has assumed through the collective determination of truth as expressed in elections. The right has assumed the ascendancy using the very tool that the left holds up as its own private property.
Yeah, no, I mean, your point is well taken, you know, in the sense that they learned a lot about how to work with facts. Yeah, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. This is here, and it's in the telling a good interpretation from a bad interpretation. I mean, this is sort of like Stanley Fish's entire career, involves working both with empirical details and with the structure of arguments and with the arguments that other people are producing at the same time in the class. And it can be done well or poorly and be done truthfully or falsely. And does the left lie and do bad interpretations? Absolutely. I mean, there's no, you know, it's not left true, right, false. It has to do with left anti-foundationalist, right foundationalist in terms of the way that it wants to embed values into an essentialist understanding of whatever the topic is that it's working with, even as it does, as you say, correctly, I think, use some of the techniques that they borrowed from us in order to make that seem more plausible than it would be otherwise. But I just, you know, the argument is ongoing and interpretation is always continuously required. And we can't just separate the two sides on the basis of that, interpret equality at any given moment. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's so provocative. And maybe this is a variation of the question that was previously asked, but I'm thinking about how you're kind of theorizing bullshit. And, you know, on Bullshit, the famous book by, what's his name, Frankfurt something? Last name Frankfurt. And I guess, my question is, how does, in the age of AI slop and things like that, can criticism's role be to distinguish between bullshit and presumably, I mean, I'm not even going to say truth, but something, at least, can we at least identify bullshit? And what role does criticism or the humanities more broadly play in terms of ascertaining bullshit versus not bullshit? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really good question. I don't want to sound sophistic about when I say this, but it's education and reading, right? So there's no formula, right, whereby you can't get a meter that, you can't get a bullshit detector that just goes around. It's a thing that you learn throughout your education, and particularly at the university level, to parse arguments, data, and determine what is a good assemblage from what is a bad one. So AI slop is going to require a new level of literacy and sophistication about what AI is, you know, how large language models work, and you know what the method is that's producing this, so that you can, you know, defend yourself against it, or just be clear about where it's coming from, whether these citations exist or not. So I mean, the thing that I think is so powerful about higher education and what's really good about universities and schools in general is the construction of non-formulaic capacities in people to deal with situations that can never actually be read formulaically. And that is pretty much, I don't know, the majority of situations that we face in our lives. So there's some easy, you know, system 1 or 2, I always get them mixed up. There's some easy, you know, blink things where you can just see this is right or this is wrong in traffic or whatever. And then there's everything else that actually matters to the construction of our society. And that's developing these complicated capacities that are very difficult just to plop out and describe, which is why it's so hard for most people to see them as valuable and to honor the slow thinking that is, and slow reading that is going on in university spaces. But we think, have to insist. Thanks for that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to go back to your idea about labor versus the PMC, that sort of this is a real crux of what we're concerned with, taking you at your word that you really are interested in this new cultural order. Like how does that come about? And it seems to me that there are two really important constituents that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. One being let's call it about 40% of college students in the US who are in community colleges, and the one strong labor union that still exists, which is the teachers' unions in the US. Those two factors, which are right at the crux of this idea of labor and PMCs. And then from your current location in the UK, where there is a strong union movement among our peers at the university level, and ask for some just sort of at the level of granularity, where is that work? Like, where does this fit into the work that is to be done? Not places like this, right? Not Yale, but that large number of people, this large number of teachers who are teaching interpretation, right? And are involved in labor, right?
Yeah.
Where are they in this project?
Right in the middle of it. I mean, your question is kind of my answer. I mean, they're absolutely on the front lines. What I think a university like Duke can help with community colleges is help fight vocationalism, to suggest that more or less automatic process education is good for, the working people that go to community colleges, whereas we would never stop education at that level for people that are going to a place like this, right? I mean, in other words, that interpretive capabilities are part of every kind of job and part of non-BA people's lives, and insist that they have it also. And then the second thing is connecting union organizing, which in US academia and also in Britain tends to be focused on wages and on other sort of those kind of labor conditions, extending that to learning conditions, to research structures, to number of hours, the timetabling and how those are divided up. In other words, connecting the labor movement to the intellectual agenda that is in fact part of the labor that they're going to end up doing. I think we have a ways to go with that.
Are you involved in that in the UK right now?
Yeah, as an observer, I mean, I'm not on a campus and I'm not a member at the UCU. And I think that they've limited themselves by not saying, look, you've proletarianized the teaching staff, or academic staff as they're called there, to the point where we can't actually do the jobs properly anymore. We're going to fight back for a mixture of teaching and research that you've driven out of a lot of universities, et cetera. And that the University of California refused a very important bargaining point with the graduate UAW strike campaign a couple of years ago, which was that they have the right to set class size in the TA sections that the teaching side of the graduate student employee workforce was dealing with. And the university simply refused, and I took that as a sign of how powerful that kind of a demand could be. If a grad student could say, look, I can't teach writing to more than 15 students, and you're making me do it with 40, and I'm going to bargain back to 20 or some compromise. That, I think, has to be brought into union politics in the way that the grad students tried to do in California.
My question kind of combines the last two, the mention of AI slop and trying to get to the people who need to hear how to interpret what is, quote, truth and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
How do we, and you mentioned this, like getting out into the community and actually participating in these conversations, because I think the people who are already here and that we're in conversation with are inclined to believe us and trust us and believe in our authority. But the people who really need to hear it and engage with these ideas are not going to come to us. We need to come to them.
Right.
So, and then the mention of like vocationalism. I mean, I think a lot of it they're being pushed towards that because of the widening wealth gap, and we can't not engage with that too.
Right.
Because if you can't pay your bills, you can't engage with these
Absolutely.
ideas. So how do you see us like engaging more in the community and bringing in people who actually need to hear what we have to say and building that trust?
Well, extension. You know, we have it for agriculture. Why don't we have it for all the other disciplines where you go to, you know, Raleigh or wherever, and there's a Duke storefront and people are like, what are your problems that we might help you think about? And that's what agricultural schools do all over the country. So I mean, the University of California has 10 campuses and over 100 agricultural stations. And they send professors out to deal with crop rust or whatever it is, soil issues. You tell me what your problem is and I'll go home and think about it. And in a week, I'll have something to say to you, and maybe it won't work and you'll go on to the next person, but at least we'll have tried and we will have set up that kind of a relationship. The other thing is, in addition to selectivity, which has really damaged the university sector's reputation with regular people, because everybody, no matter how good a student is, just getting massively rejected all of the time. That's the dominant experience. And people who aren't applying to college or not in college or past college also hear those stories, kind of hate the sector because it does seem it's elitified it, even as we inside have fought against it. There's also the cost issue. And I do not think that faculty have really come out against tuition hikes. There was a minority of us in California that worked on this for years, said we want state funding to go up and tuition to go down. And we produced a $66 report showing that if you added $66 a year to the median wage state income tax, you could roll tuition back the inflation corrected level it had in 2000 and still have more resources in the class than we did now. And the management structure wouldn't go near it because it meant more money for more affluent people, and they didn't want to alienate them. And so faculty basically just gave up rather than saying, okay, we're going to continue to, every time we go to the supermarket, talk about how opposed we are to tuition hikes and cohort tuition and 55 grand a year, et cetera. So they'll at least feel like there's somebody inside the institution, no matter how powerless we actually are individually to do anything about that cares about it. And so there's like kind of a pipeline into a better discussion about affordability.
Hey, Chris, Eli Meyerhoff. Nice to see you again. Just wonder, in addition to thinking about kind of extension possibilities, thinking about how the communities beyond the university are actually in the university already as staff, as campus workers. Just thinking about like the argument that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney make about the undercommons in the university, thinking about how people who work in non-academic positions in the university are engaged in studying already. And that's the kind of studying that isn't validated with credentials, but it's the kind of studying that gives them knowledge that requires certain interpretive capacities. Just wondering if you have thoughts on like how maybe this would be along the lines of what interpretive power for all looks like in relation to organizing to transform the political economy of the university. Maybe combining that point with your second point about priority of non-economic life, like what is, maybe we could look at like the AUP and other labor unions pushes towards wall-to-wall unions in universities, in that kind of push, like what could that look like for change in literary or criticism kind of disciplines? Like how could the sort of movement you're calling for be like symbiotic with that kind of movement?
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. yes, so I want to say that this is something that every people do. So you don't have to be part of academic staff, right? I mean, everybody that works here, the hotel where I'm staying, is engaged in this practice. And we have some things to say about regularizing it or making it seem valid in different kinds of contexts outside the ones that they operate in on a daily basis. But it's already happening. It's a question of building on that. Intra-university alliances are essential. And they actually, at UC and some other universities, they've been the backbone of positive change. I mean, it really has been happening. In terms of non-economic life, I just think it's something to thematize with people and get more and better ideas than I certainly have about it from a wider range of experiences and build on that. And you're totally right to say that we can start with the people that we see every single day. And, we have started with that. I mean, we're influenced by them and bring their ideas into the classroom. And it's a good model for doing more off-campus work as well. I mean, we should talk more about this. Thank you. Yeah, Robin.
Yeah, hi. Chris, thank you so much. One of the things that your talk has done for me is to explain why the university is such a target, right, of right-wing attack, which I find really useful because I think that a lot of times we don't understand, the power that we've had, right? There's a but here. But there's a whole layer, I think, not a layer. I've been reading this book by Zahid Chaudhry called Paranoid Publics on the Psychopolitics of Truth. And there he argues, I think quite convincingly, that we are no longer in an epistemic political field or terrain, that the alternative facts and post-truth and precisely what you were talking about, in terms of the theater of knowledge destruction, what it creates then is anger as what is turned to, and so that the emotional, the psychopolitics, so he brings psychoanalysis back into the conversation, right, about the political as opposed to the rational, as opposed to the truth-seeking, as opposed to wanting to have facts to counter post-facts. And I think that what I'm convinced about the book is that it's it seems like an accurate diagnosis of the political culture of the present, and that it would fulfill, in some sense, not what to do, but just as a diagnosis, Stuart Hall's sense about Thatcher, that the left hadn't become capable of dealing with Thatcher because it didn't have a moral political understanding of the characteristics of the age. And it's almost the quote from him is something like that.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what kind of critical thinking the present requires, not the doing, like many of the questions here have been, what do we do, right? But what might have changed when we're not dealing with the right of Reaganism, we're dealing with an authoritarian right, for which, just that denial, right? So that seems to me to be a different moment that doesn't seem as deeply entrenched in an epistemological problem.
Yeah. I'm skeptical that we can be post-epistemological. I think we're struggling over it. And I say that in part because the right is really invested in their claims being true and valid and therefore things that compel a sense in the same way. It's not only anger, coercion, but it's also, if you watch Fox News, as I did last night for a while about Minneapolis, they're constructing an elaborate counter narrative about how 80% of Somalis are on welfare and they have all these fake businesses, and that's why ICE is there doing what they're doing, right? So
that seems to be interpretive, but not epistemological. I guess that's what right? Where we want our epistemologies to be grounded still in a notion of truth and good and a kind of moral register of,
I don't think that they're.
And I'm wondering whether the left has to give up that desire to be good and to think that the political is the sphere in which we produce
our non-complicity, et cetera.
Okay, well, that last part I really agree with, in that you have to be multimodal. And so there's some particularly good left podcasters, for example, are enraged and have a very wide affective scale compared to traditional presenters or some of the, the odd lots kind of Bloomberg version of podcasting. So we absolutely do have to do that. I'm just quibbling about the term epistemological, because when I'm watching Fox, I'm thinking, okay, they're really trying to set this up for their audience as the true reality of Minneapolis compared to all that stuff that you're seeing on CNN. I still think there's the battle for truth is there, even as we now know, have known for quite a while, actually, especially in criticism, that has to be supplemented with these other modalities and integrated. And there's no such thing as just a critical thinking argument. I may not be, let's talk about this later, because I may not be completely understanding this, but I think that someone like Vance is always asserting an epistemological understructure, even as he's saying things that clearly conflict with, for example, video evidence of the ICE killing of Renee Good. He's trying to trump that anyway.
Hey, thank you so much for this provocative talk. Appreciate it. Just a quick question. It seems like there's some hopeful notes in what you've presented today as to the success of identifying this kind of critical basis for this new order. But at the same time, I would love to hear you talk more at any length, short, long, I know lunch is waiting, about how it seems that the critics haven't really even had success in creating the new order inside the university, much less like society as a whole. And here I'm talking about things like, various reward systems that you mentioned that don't reward, for instance, the community engagement, the idea of the scholar on every corner helping people solve their problems. I work in public history, which has for years been just, set off to the side as not serious. And so trying to even get the university to change enough to create conditions that would allow us to create this outside, it feels like the university has been extremely resistant to that, including people that consider themselves critics.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a mistake for us to have a kind of a beloved community to the side of the quantitative apparatuses that have really taken over the evaluation of research in STEM fields and so on. I mean, we just haven't really paid attention to that. So we have really a ton of work to do. But I think in a sort of, I don't know, non-unified, scattered sort of way, these elements are alive, powerful, and influential. And I set it up as knowledge demands coming from the outside, because the polling data suggests that large pluralities, if not majorities of people, don't want large corporations to run the economy, don't want the US to be in Venezuela and Iran and wherever else Trump, Greenland, Denmark, really do want civil peace rather than civil war, and would like some ideas about how to get there. And don't want democracy just to be, the same people essentially deciding everything without talking to them about it. And I mean, there is polling data that suggests that that's already out there. We have not uniquely invented these ideas, obviously, but we've assembled them around as things that are interconnected, and that second are linked to a scholarly practice that we take very seriously, that I do think has had an influence that is working, even as we speak. In the judiciary, for example, in the scientists that have hung in there and stuff, in the resistance going on in the streets, there's all this thinking and feeling connected that is looking towards something other than what we have right now, and has built elements of it over time that have to continuously be not just defended, but actually rebuilt as we go forward, including the discipline of public history, for which I predict a renaissance.
Right.
That point well taken. It's an ongoing work. I just want us to really pay attention to not only the victories, but the strength of the elements that are there because, and I think it's ironic that their power is registered more by the people that dislike them, these ideas, by the right, who are constantly in an uproar about our supposedly unimportant ideas. Then they take them more seriously than we do, and I'm just trying to get that. Thank you. I really
Yes.
love the discussion. Thanks.
Great.
For